Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my tight end draft strategies as we approach our upcoming 2025 fantasy football draft. Now, just a couple of days ago, I spoke on my early round draft strategies for the 2025 season. And within said video, I addressed the tight end position and how we should be navigating rounds 1 through 4, specifically with the 3 stud tight ends we have on screen: Brock Bowers, Trey McBride, and George Kittle. We specifically spoke on their potential ADPs, the average draft positions that they possess within these 4 different platforms, and how we should be utilizing said ADPs to take advantage of their individual value. Because all of us have experienced the idea of rostering a tight end who's averaging 6-7 fantasy points per week throughout the season, and the inequality of value between tight ends as such in comparison to these stud tight ends who could potentially score up to 14 fantasy points per game on average in a half PPR this upcoming season. That inequality certainly does give a positional advantage to your opponents. Therefore, the question is prompted: should we be drafting stud tight ends in 2025? Should we be utilizing early round draft capital to gain an advantage within the position and then not have to worry about said position for the remainder of the season? Now, within that overall conversation, again, of course, we all want to have positional advantages, whether it be at running back, wide receiver, but of course, specifically within the one-start positions such as tight end, quarterback. But there are other one-start positions in fantasy football, those being the kicker and team defensive positions. So I want to go ahead and look at the big picture of fantasy football. When we talk about utilizing early round draft capital on studs like Bowers, McBride, and Kittle, it makes sense because you're gaining an early advantage. But outside of the top 5 potential tight ends within a given season, we really should be careful with tight ends, especially when you're drafting them with early round draft capital. The reason why I present this is because over the course of the last 3 seasons, from 2022 to 2024, there have been more kickers that have scored over 150 fantasy points than tight ends in a half PPR scoring format. Of course, this most recent season in 2024, only 5 tight ends scored over 150 fantasy points. 8 kickers accomplished that, and 2 team defenses. So if we find ourselves in a position in which we're prioritizing the tight end position because of its positional advantage that we're gaining by selecting an early stud at the position, then we should also be kind of keeping that same energy with the kicker and defensive conversation. Specifically, the kicker on screen, Brandon Aubrey of the Dallas Cowboys. Over the course of the last 2 seasons, he has scored 192 and 181 fantasy points. In comparison to George Kittle's fantasy point totals over the course of the last 2 seasons, Brandon Aubrey has only scored 5 less points than George Kittle. And despite that being the case, their ADP differential is ridiculous. George Kittle, again, right now on Sleeper, 38.8. On ESPN, 36.0. On Yahoo, 32.9. Brandon Aubrey's ADP on like ESPN and Yahoo is 109 and 84.1. I mean, you can go ahead and draft Brandon Aubrey right ahead of the number 8 tight end being selected: David Njoku, Ingram, Kraft, Warren, Loveland on Yahoo. Or potentially you can draft him just slightly ahead based on ADP, ahead of guys like Kraft, Loveland, Warren, and Kincaid on ESPN right before the number 11 tight end comes off the board. Now, the reason why that's so crazy is because Brandon Aubrey is putting up 191 or 182 fantasy points in the last 2 seasons, and he's putting up top 3 numbers in terms of tight end production, and yet he isn't being prioritized like these early round draft capital tight ends are. So if we're going to be looking for positional advantages, why not go after a kicker or potentially even a team defense? Now, I've gone ahead and represented the Bills defense with Greg Rousseau, their defensive end. Again, one of the better players on that defense as a whole. But when we're talking about team defenses, again, the last couple seasons, 2, 6, and 4. But if we talk about the Buffalo Bills, in the last 3 seasons, they have ranked as the number 6, number 4, and number 6 overall defense, putting up 133, 153, and 136 fantasy points within those 3 seasons. Now, to take it even a step further, if we go ahead and take the averages of those 3 seasons, that's 141 fantasy points, which is the equivalent over the course of the last 3 seasons as the number 7 overall tight end. And yet, of course, the Buffalo Bills in their current ADP on ESPN sits at 149.8, on Sleeper sits at 233.8. In comparison to a tight end that currently is the ADP number 7 overall tight end, Mark Andrews, who is going on, Sleeper at 81.6, or of course ESPN at 81.3. You can go ahead and get equivalent value of contributions towards your teams at far later prices in comparison to where they're currently going. And for those of you who are leaning towards the idea, well, Andrew, Mark Andrews has been consistent year over year since 2019. Well, so have the Buffalo Bills defense. The Buffalo Bills defense have been a top 10 ranked unit for fantasy purposes since 2019 every single season. So of course the value is innately there. So why not invest in that direction as well? Now, again, this may be a quick dialogue on the idea of abolishing kickers or defenses, or of course, just letting you know that you need to be focusing on said position as we approach this upcoming season, because besides the advantages that you'll be aiming for at the tight end position, there are others to gain over the course of your upcoming drafts. Now, before I get further within the topic of conversation and answer the question as to whether or not we are drafting a stud tight end in 2025, potentially waiting for the middle round tight ends, or punting on the position completely and drafting sleepers, for those of you guys who want to gain an advantage upon your league mates, not only with the videos I'm providing and content, but of course with rankings over the course of this entire season, whether it's draft rankings over the course of the month of August, or of course Sunday morning rankings for the entirety of the season, be sure to travel down to the description of the video and check out Betr. I'll be partnering with them for the entire season, of course providing picks and putting my predictions to the test, but also providing said rankings. All you have to do is sign up using code Andrew today, make that first time deposit minimum of $10, and make that first time play minimum of $1 within the sports category. Once you go ahead and do all three of those steps, I'll go ahead and send you my draft rankings up to date for the 2025 upcoming drafts, half PPR, full PPR, by position, by tier, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, defense, and top 200 flex. I even include super flex rankings within the conversation. So for those of you interested, take advantage of the opportunity. And of course, take advantage of the idea that you're going to get Sunday morning rankings every single week for the remainder of the season. So if you're wondering if you're eligible, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility based on your current location. And if you play up to $10 today, you'll get up to $30 via Betr. So take advantage of the opportunity. Thank you very much for all the support. Okay, let's continue on with the tight end conversation, because we know that the tight end position is extremely volatile and it lacks depth. If it didn't lack depth, then we wouldn't be talking about kickers and team defenses over the course of the last 5 minutes, yet we have. So when we talk about the tight end stats on a per week basis over the course of the last decade, we have found that the tight end position has been regressing at some points, but there are some occasional promising trends that we have found. The 2024 season produced the most receptions on a per week basis at the tight end position over the course of the last decade, and that's primarily because of the highlighted number of 224.24 targets per week. Again, we all know that opportunity leads to success in fantasy football. And with those opportunities, of course, there will be more receptions and more inherent fantasy upside. Now, where the tight end position has lacked the most over the course of the last 2 seasons has been in terms of scoring touchdowns on a per week basis. In fact, those are the 2 lowest seasons over the course of the past decade. And even though we have often had to rely upon touchdowns really elevating the tight end position, because of the scarcity of said touchdowns, we have to rely upon it even that much more going forward, unless we're purely going to be aiming for players that are PPR monsters, not going to find themselves in the end zone, but are going to catch themselves over 80 potential receptions. Someone like an Evan Ingram, for example, in the past. Now, when we continue on with the idea of how valuable touchdowns are because of said scarcity, what I want to do is I want to quantify the value of said touchdowns. Besides the 6 fantasy points that a tight end gets, again, the value of touchdowns is incredibly rare, because touchdowns often means that you're going to finish within the top 12 rankings at the tight end position. Specifically in 2024, from weeks 1 through 18, the top 24 tight ends from each individual week led to scoring 178 total touchdowns, which again, fantastic numbers. But of the top 24 tight ends, the top 12 scored 144 of those touchdowns within their given weeks. And of course, the remaining 34 from tight ends ranked 13 through 24 within said weeks. Again, 81% of the touchdowns scored leading to a tight end 1 performance within a given week from weeks 1 through 18 of last season. So again, if you want your tight end to consistently be in that top 12 conversation on a weekly basis, they're going to have to score touchdowns. And again, there are some tight ends that are going to score a boatload of touchdowns like a Mark Andrews. And then there are going to be tight ends on the opposite end of the spectrum, in which we have someone like Trey McBride getting all the targets, but only scoring 2 receiving touchdowns in 2024. But when we go even further and we talk about the fact that 60.18% of the top 12 performances over the course of weeks 1 through 18 of last season led to at least scoring 1 receiving touchdown. That means 7.2 out of the top tight end 1s within a given week score a touchdown. So again, it becomes that much more of a competitive factor of we need to go ahead and aim for tight ends that are scoring touchdowns. Within 2024's top 12 ranked tight ends, they scored about 79% of their touchdowns within the red zone last season, and 57% of their total receiving touchdowns inside the 10-yard line. Again, if you want to score touchdowns, it has to be within the red zone conversation. So you have to be associated with a football team that is going to consistently get into that red zone conversation. And we should all be looking for tight ends that are associated within those positions. As we all know, predicting touchdowns in fantasy football is one of the most impossible things to do. Yet we have to rely on the fact that if we don't draft a tight end that scores a consistent volume of touchdowns, we're not going to have a valuable tight end unless they're getting themselves a boatload of receptions and, of course, receiving yards. So as we approach this upcoming season, we have to kind of take into account that a lot of the tight ends that we talk about within the top 12 capacity aren't going to score a lot of touchdowns. And their fantasy ADP and value needs to reflect that. And basically what we have seen over the course of the last couple seasons, based on the fact that we have seen less and less touchdowns scored at the position, the current ADP of the position kind of demonstrates that already. And that's primarily due to the drop-off in production at said position. So of course, this is a statistic that I've mentioned to you guys year over year. And I once again want to reintroduce the drop-off in production. When we look at the averages of the top 12 running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends in a half PPR scoring format over the course of the last 2 seasons. So basically, for the number one tight end, 201.5 fantasy points. That is the average between Sam Laporta's 2023 season, because he was the number one tight end that year, and Brock Bowers' 2024 rookie season, as he was the number one tight end that season. 201 fantasy points being the average. When we talk about the potential value in the drop-off in production, the tight end position within the top 12, their value disappears and splits in nearly half by the time you get to the tight end 12. Now, when we're comparing the value of someone like Brock Bowers, who is projected to be the number one tight end in this upcoming season, based on the averages in a half PPR over the course of the last 2 seasons, considering the drop-off in production is incredibly quick to lose value in terms of total fantasy point contribution, going from, tight end 1 to tight end 2, we have a 16-point difference there, considering the drop-off in that capacity. When we're aiming to potentially draft the number one tight end, we should be looking to draft them after the first 12 running backs and potentially the first 9 wide receivers on average over the course of the last 2 seasons have been taken. So as a total, that's 21 players. So if you were to take Brock Bowers at number 22 ADP overall within the second round, I think that would be a valuable position to be selecting him. Now, if we talk about the number 2 tight end, 185.5 fantasy points, under the assumption that Trey McBride or George Kittle put up that kind of volume of points, you'd have to wait until 33 total players. The RB 18 and the wide receiver 15 are off the board to be able to select them in the 3rd round. Again, still comparable value to where their current ADPs are, but that's just kind of the positional drop-off in production values that we would be comparing them to. Now, this is under the assumption that you can perfectly predict the outcome of each of these tight ends, that we know for a fact that McBride and Kittle are going to be the number 2 and number 3 tight ends at that very similar fantasy point range. But as we know, it's impossible to predict this within 100% accuracy. But that's kind of what this industry is kind of trended towards. The assumption that we can predict at such a high level of accuracy, which just truly isn't the case. When we look at the year-over-year turnover at the tight end position, very similar to running back and wide receiver like we've talked about in the previous days. I mean, as it currently stands on Sleeper, ESPN, Yahoo, the current ADP in terms of expected tight ends to return to top 12 standings is about 8 to 9 tight ends depending on the platform. Based on the history of the position over the course of the last 5 years, we have seen on average on a per season basis 5 returning tight ends from one year to the next. Therefore, we should expect only 5 of the top 12 tight ends from 2024 to return in 2025. Which tight ends are we talking about in specific? Well, if I was to put my money where my mouth was, that would be Bowers, McBride, Kittle, Laporta, and Kelsey to repeat this upcoming season. The most likely to be able to do so, considering their volume of opportunity and, of course, their efficiency within the position and, of course, being able to stay healthy, etc., all those kind of metrics. Now, despite this being the case, we have 3 or 4 additional tight ends that were top 12 at the position last season, still within the current ADP of the top 12, which again are the trap players, the guys that we want to be avoiding, the players that are, again, are after the studs have been taken, players such as Mark Andrews or Tucker Kraft that were, of course, top 12 of the position last season, but can they return to success this upcoming year? Now, additionally, we also have a pretty good contingency of tight ends that on a year-by-year basis get into the conversation of being first-time tight end ones. Over the course of the last 5 seasons, 18 total, which is 3.6 on a per season average, which is about 4. So if we're getting about, on average, 5 tight ends that go from year over year to being tight end 1 to tight end 1, we get about 4 newcomers. And then the rest of the tight ends are tight ends who have been tight end ones in the past, but just not on a consecutive yearly basis because of injuries. For example, guys like TJ Hawkinson going into this upcoming season, who I have a lot of potential kind of hype surrounding. I expect him to play well. But as it currently stands, considering these return rates, yes, you should be drafting an early stud tight end. And if you're not going to, then push it down the line and maybe go after someone that is going to be a first-time tight end within the position, because we have found year over year a lot of potential for success for tight ends that have just come into the league and found themselves becoming the number one overall at the position. Specifically, of course, Brock Bowers and Sam Laporta. So why not potentially tail that trend? And if you're not going to select someone within the top 5 of the position, just punt all the way down the line and go ahead and try to hit the waiver wires, or even try to draft a couple sleepers that are going to pan out when it's all said and done. Now, last season, when I talked about my tight end draft strategy, I made the following predictions. I said that based on their current ADPs, these would be the 5 tight ends that had the potential of breaking out and becoming a consistent sleeper option who could become a tight end one for the first time in their careers in 2024. I predicted Brock Bowers, Luke Musgrave, Tyler Conklin, Cade Otton, and Ben Sinnott. Now, as we all know, Brock Bowers finishes the number 1 overall tight end. But again, he was already at a top 12 ADP last year, so it wasn't crazy that he was able to get into that overall conversation. Luke Musgrave was a miss, but the tight end that you can see on screen in the bottom right, that's Tucker Kraft. Luke Musgrave got hurt early, and Tucker Kraft took over and was the number 9 overall tight end. So the team was correct, just not the right player. Tyler Conklin finished as tight end 19, no great overall production. Cade Otton was special, finished as the tight end 13 overall, which was great. And then Ben Sinnott, of course, did not take over for Zach Ertz because Zach Ertz played a full healthy season and finished as the number 8 overall tight end. So in regards to the teams in which they were associated with, we're accurate. So as we approach this upcoming season, I feel relatively confident in the idea of following these tight ends if, in fact, you decide to punt on the position and look for the later round studs. For example, Tyler Warren of the Indianapolis Colts, a first-round selected tight end within the NFL draft in 2025. His current ADPs on Sleeper 118, ESPN 133, Yahoo 121. You can get him in the potential 10th, 11th round of your upcoming drafts. And of course, he can very easily finish as a top 12 tight end for fantasy purposes. Colston Loveland in the same conversation of being a first-round selection of the 2025 NFL draft. His current ADP is very similar, 117, 126, 126.2. Why not go ahead and invest in this direction? Or go even further by grabbing one of Tyler Warren and Colston Loveland and pairing them up with maybe someone like Brenton Strange, who is going to be filling in for Evan Ingram, as Evan Ingram is no longer on the Jacksonville Jaguars. You have Liam Cohen, an offensive genius and guru with the Jacksonville Jaguars, who is going to help elevate someone like Brenton Strange. Again, he elevated Cade Otton to being the number 13 tight end last season, so why not Brenton Strange this year with a current ADP of 183, 169, 134. Or Mason Taylor, a third rookie, tight end that I wanted to mention in terms of potential sleeper options that is associated with the Jets. I know that he recently sustained an injury to his ankle. If this isn't something that is going to hold him out for, week 1, then I'm still certainly investing in the direction of Mason Taylor because of, the Jets offense as a whole. Garrett Wilson's clearly the number 1 receiving option. And considering you have a rushing quarterback, the receiving upside of Breece Hall isn't as impactful. Therefore, when you have a scrambling or rushing Justin Fields, he's not going to be looking in the direction consistently of someone like Allen Lazard or Josh Reynolds. Instead, Mason Taylor, the rookie tight end, can certainly be an impact player within that offense. So in my mind, again, unless you're taking one of those top 5 tight ends at the position and utilizing early draft capital, which again, if you're going to do so, maybe keep an eye on, kickers and defenses that you also are going to prioritize and gain an, positional advantage within. But if you're not going to be utilizing early round draft capital because the opportunity doesn't present itself, because where you are drafting from, you would have to reach in order to select an early tight end. And of course, you don't want to put yourself in a vulnerable position there. Take the value that you are being given at running back, wide receiver, or potentially quarterback, and then kick the can down the road. Select a sleeper because, again, over the course of the last 2 seasons, Laporta and Bowers have accomplished it. Why not Warren and Loveland in 2025? All right, that's going to cover it for me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Again, for those of you guys who enjoyed today's information and you want more, you can go ahead and find my 2025 Fantasy Football Draft Guide exclusively on Patreon. There's a link down in the description. Via the Patreon, you can ask me individually unlimited questions. You'll get access to my draft rankings over the course of the month of August, private Discord community server access, all of that. So if you're interested, check that out below. But of course, if you want to not potentially go down that path of the monthly subscription. You can always check out Betr. Again, there's a link down in the description. Using code Andrew, making that first time deposit minimum of $10 and a $1 minimum entry within the sports category will get you those draft rankings every single week over the course of the month of August. And of course, every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season, weeks 1 through 18. So be sure to check that out today. Head on over to Betr. Again, as of right now, there's a lot of plays in regards to the preseason. So if that's something that you're interested in, be sure to do so. Thank you very much. But that's going to cover it for me today. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.